So good evening and welcome to Portland Public Schools Parent University. And Parent University is a platform where families can learn and engage with various topics of interest. May is Asian Pacific Heritage Month. And in support of that recognition, particularly at this time when hate crimes against Asian Pacific Islanders are on the rise, we want to raise awareness about how the complex history of the United States, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam are intertwined in relation to the armed conflict in the region. We are very excited about tonight's program. The first part of the presentation will focus on the historical highlight of the Vietnam conflict and its impact on neighboring countries, specifically Laos and Cambodia. Then in the second half of the hour are our panelists who will talk about their experiences of survival, hope, and resilience. Nanette, you want to stop sharing?
Mm-hmm.
We encourage you to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to send us some questions. The last half hour of the session will be our question and answer period. And I always forget to introduce myself. My name is Grace Valenzuela, and I'm the Executive Director for Communications and Community Partnership for Portland Public Schools. So tonight, to start us off with a very condensed historical background, is Christopher Beam. Chris has devoted his professional life to the study of the past as an archivist and teacher. He worked at the National Archives and spent time processing Nixon White House tapes. He was also an archivist at the Edmund Muskie and Bates College. Since 1989, he has taught history, including courses on the Vietnam War and Nixon presidency at Bates, USM, UNE, Central Maine Community College, and American Public University. A native of Brunswick, Maine, he graduated from Williams College in 1967, served 3 years in the US Marine Corps, including a tour in Vietnam in 68 and 69, and earned a PhD in history from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He is a resident of Lewiston and is married and has 3 children and 6 grandchildren. So, Chris, you can take it away.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Grace. And I want to thank the Portland Public School System for asking me to participate in this. I can't say I like it, but I find it rewarding to share my experiences and my historical perspective on what was a very divisive conflict in American history, and one that had devastating impacts on the peoples of Southeast Asia. Actually, I've been given a really tall order to give a historical perspective, because when I teach courses on the Vietnam War, I start off with about the year 40 of the Common Era, and that's when there was a rebellion in Vietnam against the Chinese, led by the Trung sisters. So Vietnam, at least, had a long history, and that had a big bearing on the development of modern Vietnamese political culture. I just want to fill in, first of all, some personal details. Grace gave you a kind of overview, but there's a little more I want to add. Because my personal history does intersect with my my professional life, and I have had the unique opportunity to study the Vietnam War, and particularly on the domestic side as it unfolded. As Grace said, I'm from Brunswick, Maine. I graduated from college in 1967. And at the time, and I think this is where it's important, I always tell students, you really have to put yourself in a different era. There was a whole different mindset in the United States. The American presence in Vietnam had escalated to the point where by the end of 1967, there were 500,000 US troops in Vietnam, and the United States was bombing North Vietnam. Now, there was a difference between North and South Vietnam. I don't know if I want to get into the complex history of why that came about. By the way, am I speaking too fast for an interpreter?
Yes, a little bit.
Yeah, okay, I'll try to slow it down a bit so that it can be interpreted correctly. And at the time, unlike today, there was a draft in effect. Young men were being drafted into the military, or at least had to face the prospect of the draft. And I must say that when in early 1967, I thought the United States was doing the right thing in Vietnam. I agreed with it. I agreed with the policy. There was dissension growing in the United States, but it was still minority opinion. And I felt it was my duty to serve in the United States military. And so in January of 1967, before I graduated, I enlisted in the United States Marine Corps and under my contract, I was supposed to report to duty in September of 1967. Well, lo and behold, what happened was that in that period, I started to have doubts about what the US was doing over there. And mostly it was because after I enlisted, I started looking a little more deeply, not only into the history of Vietnam, but the history of the US involvement in Vietnam, and in particular when the French had colonized Vietnam. And what I saw, I didn't like, but it was too late. You know, once I had signed up, I couldn't just say, well, I want out of this and I want to quit. In any event, I went into, because of my background, my father was a professor and a college professor, and I came from a middle-class background, so I enlisted in an officer training course. And in September of 1967, I reported for officer candidate school in Quantico, Virginia. I went 10 weeks to boot camp, kind of boot camp there. And then I was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the United States Marines and started what was called the basic school. I want to say this. I heard when I was in college arguments against the Vietnam War, but I think what really drove home to me, really implanted doubts in my mind, is what I heard from the sergeants who were training us in officer candidate school. Now, these guys were not dissenters by any means. All of them were Vietnam veterans. All of them had done a tour over there. But one thing they said is that, and they put it in negative terms, is that you can't really trust the Vietnamese people, mainly because a lot of them appeared to be sympathetic to the Viet Cong insurgents and didn't want the United States, the Americans over there. And the way the war had been presented to the American public was that the United States was over there to protect the people of South Vietnam from communist aggression. And that started planting doubts in my mind. And those doubts actually intensified when I was in basic school and what was called a Tet Offensive broke out. And that was a massive offensive by the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese against South Vietnam. Now, it was beaten back, but it caused considerable disruption at home. And also, there was a lot going on in the United States. In April of 1968, Martin Luther King Jr., who had been sort of really the icon of the civil rights movement, was assassinated. There were riots across the country. I know we were told not to go up to Washington, D.C. on the weekend because it was an armed camp and things of this nature. So there's a sense that things at home were kind of unraveling. In any event, but that didn't stop what was happening to me. I was lucky when I was in the Marine Corps in the sense that many of the people in my basic school class went into the infantry, and that's where life expectancy was a lot shorter. I was put into a logistics support unit, and that is in motor transport. And I had orders for Vietnam. I left the United States in June of 1968. I actually didn't go to Vietnam immediately. I spent some time on Okinawa. And then finally in November of 1968, I went south to Vietnam. and I was attached to the Navy for a couple of months. It seemed that the Navy took frequent vacations because we went to Singapore, the Philippines, and Hong Kong, and that sort of thing. I'm telling you this story because my story, I had very limited combat exposure in Vietnam. And in fact, I think that was true with maybe the majority of the Americans in Vietnam. One thing that impressed me when I was in Vietnam is just how mammoth the US presence was in that country. And it seemed to me it had a very disruptive effect upon Vietnamese life and so forth. In January of 1969, my unit went ashore and I was in Vietnam from January of 1969 to July of 1969. All of us, Doug will tell you this, all of us who went over to Vietnam had what was called a fixed tour duty. It was usually 12 months, or if you're in the Marine Corps, it's 13 months. So we knew exactly when we were supposed to get home. And I got home in mid-July of 1969. By the time I got home from Vietnam, I would consider myself very staunchly opposed to what the US was doing over there. But there was not much I could do about it. I was scheduled to get out in November of 1969, but by mid-1969, President Richard Nixon, who was elected in 1968, was beginning a gradual drawdown of US troops in Vietnam. And as a result, and part of this was to lower the casualties, lower the draft calls and so forth. The anti-war movement was picking up, but while I didn't participate in it, I couldn't in the military, I still identified with it. I always loved history, and as a result of that, I decided I would go to graduate school and earn a degree, advanced degree in history. I got to the University of Illinois, and when I was at the University of Illinois, I majored in early American history, not much to do with Vietnam. When I got my PhD from the University of Illinois in 1975, I looked around for a teaching job. I couldn't find a thing, and so I went to work at the National Archives. And I was assigned to the Nixon Presidential Materials Project. Now, the story of Nixon's presidency is, could go as a long, long story. But Nixon got caught up in 1972, 73 in the Watergate scandal. And one of the features of the Watergate scandal was the discovery that Nixon had recorded 2.5 years of his conversations in the White House. And so those tapes were acquired by the National Archives, and I was on the team that processed those. And there were about 3,700 hours of conversation. I probably listened to about 1,500 hours of those conversations, with hundreds of hours discussing the Vietnam War, discussing great power diplomacy, discussing the internal politics in the United States, the opposition, and how the Nixon administration was going to deal with this. I remember, and this might be of interest to Doug, but one of the first projects I was put on is this. We got a court order to produce transcripts of conversations about demonstrations that occurred from mid-April of 1971 to mid-May of 1971. And in that period, there were 3 demonstrations against the war. The first was probably numbered a few hundred people, and that was a week-long series of demonstrations by a group that I eventually joined very briefly, and that was the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. On the 23rd or 24th of April, there was a big demonstration in Washington, D.C. And then in the first week of May, something called the May Day tribe came to town to try to shut down the government. And listening to Nixon's reactions to these demonstrations really gave me a political lesson. It was clear that the Nixon administration was the most worried about the Vietnam Veterans Against the War demonstration. They were absolutely ecstatic when the May Day tribe came to town, mainly because there was a huge public reaction against it. In any event, I don't know if I'm really giving you a good history of what's going on here, but Nixon's policies in Vietnam were quite controversial. There was a lot of opposition to it. But I think by the beginning of 1972, he had gained the upper hand politically. And in 1972, in November, he ran for re-election, and he was elected overwhelmingly in a landslide against the Democratic candidate who was most closely identified with the anti-war movement. In late 1972, Nixon ordered, when the peace talks broke down, he ordered a massive bombing campaign against North Vietnam. And in January of 1973, a peace agreement was signed among the South Vietnamese government, the US government, North Vietnam, and the Viet Cong, now called the Provisional Revolutionary Government. Effectively, that ended the war in Vietnam for the United States. The war in Vietnam continued for over 2 more years. Okay, Nixon had promised that he would support the South Vietnamese government if the opposition, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, got active again. But by March of 1973, Nixon was fighting for his political life because the Watergate scandal was imploding on him. In any event, Nixon had to resign in the summer of 1974 rather than face certain impeachment and conviction. Gerald Ford, his successor, was not politically strong. And in the spring of 1975, that's when the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong launched a final offensive. There was nothing really that the Ford administration could do about it. I don't know if this really gives you a good hand. One of the problems I had when I was putting this together is trying to figure out what to put in there. There is so much detail that can be discussed about this. There are a lot of complexities. It's a very complex story. And when I've taught the course, when I first started teaching the course, I mostly focused on the United States. But then I discovered, well, obviously that's not a good story. One has to look at what was going on within Vietnam, how the Vietnamese were reacting, how the different parties, the different forces in Vietnam were reacting, and to look at the history of Vietnam itself, particularly the long struggle of the Vietnamese against outside political control, mostly against the Chinese, starting in the 19th century against the French, and then later on against the United States. And also one has to look at other powers that had an influence on Vietnam's history. Japan, for example, had a decisive impact when it occupied Southeast Asia in 1940 to 45. And obviously the roles of Communist China, the People's Republic of China, and the Soviet Union. As far as Laos and Cambodia, to a certain extent, as far as the Vietnam War is concerned, it sounds like they were sideshows, but in fact, they were very, very important. Laos was an entryway for the North Vietnamese, sending troops and supplies into the south. Cambodia struggled to remain neutral, but in 1970, Prince Sihanouk, who was trying to stay neutral, was overthrown. A pro-US military government took over, and Cambodia became engulfed in a civil war. When the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong took over Saigon in April of 1975, the Khmer Rouge, who had had a tacit alliance with them, took over Cambodia. But it quickly became apparent that the Khmer Rouge and the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese did not get along. They were aligned with different powers, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong with the Soviet Union, the Khmer Rouge with Communist China. And in a sense, that tells another story. One of the things that I grew up with is the notion that the communist world was a monolith and with one goal in mind, and that was to take over the world. By the end of 1968, I think it was becoming apparent that that just wasn't the case, that there was no real solidarity within the communist world, that there were intense and sometimes violent rivalries, which would have a big impact on the way I viewed the Vietnam War. In any event, I would say that the Vietnam War, for me personally, did shape my attitudes about the United States, about the role of the US in the world at large, and also, I think, deepen my own understanding of how to study the past. So in any event, that's, I think I've about taken up the time. As I say, I feel a little frustrated here because the history of the Vietnam War is very complex. It's multifaceted, multidimensional. It's very difficult to cover in a half hour. But if you have any questions, I'll be glad to field them or comments. Thank you. Linda, I think you're muted. Okay.
Thank you very, Nanette, could you stop the slideshow just a second? Because I have to, so I have to introduce the panelists. So, but before that, I just want to say that about 1.3 million refugees from Southeast Asia came to the United States as an outcome of the war. They were settled here. And while the circumstances of their war experiences, their journey to the US, and the conditions in which they find themselves as new arrivals vary greatly, children and adults displaced from the war endure a tremendous amount of trauma, stress, and adversity that can impact their functioning and development. At the same time, many of these families demonstrate profound strength and resilience in their survival strategies and ability to adapt to a completely unfamiliar environment. So these stories of survival, hope, and resilience will be shared by our next set of panelists. So we have some people who are going to do their presentations using a Pechakucha, the PK format, which is showing slides and telling their stories, through pictures. And then there are, the other half are two panelists who do not have the picture because they just joined us recently. And so I'll introduce them. So I have introduce the panelists in alphabetical order. So Rata Chan moved to the United States with his mother and sisters in 1985, and they were settled in Biddeford, Maine, as refugees having survived the killing fields of Cambodia. Rata went to Boston University, has a BS degree, major in international relations and rural economic development. Rata has served several financial institutions in Maine and New Hampshire and has been in banking for over 20 years. He's currently serving as Vice President Commercial Credit Manager at TD Bank. Rata and his partner and two sons reside in Saco. He is a founding member of the Killing Field Survivor Society, founding member of the Asian American Heritage Foundation, has served on the Diversity Cabinet Committee of the United Way of Greater Portland, and on the Board of Tax Assessment Appeal for the City of Saco, Maine. He is currently serving as Board of Director for the Elmina Sewell Foundation and the Anna Asvatsurian Foundation. He is a board advisor of the Unified Asian Community, Cambodian Community Association, and the Greater Portland Welcoming Center. With all of that, he has time to join us. So thank you, Rata. Caitlyn Huon is a daughter of Vietnamese refugees. She is currently a proud student at Portland High School. And in 2020, Caitlyn was the recipient of the Rising Tide Leadership Award. She is an athlete and a scholar. Doug Rawlings was drafted and sent to Vietnam on July 2nd, 1969, where he joined the 15th Artillery. 16 years later, he was one of the 5 people who formed the organization Veterans for Peace. He's the Maine chapter president. He has taught at the University of Maine, Farmington, where he ran their development writing program. Terry Lang Ryder. Terry was born and raised in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. She has a BA in business and earned English proficiency certificate in Singapore. She's nationally qualified medical and legal interpreter and translator for the Khmer language. She's currently a full-time medical interpreter for Maine Health. Terry volunteered extensively in Cambodia and is a founding member and current president of Imagine Cambodia Foundation, a nonprofit organization that cares for orphaned and vulnerable children. She's also a board member of the Cambodian Community Association of Maine. Thuy Wen Sullivan. Thuy was born in Hue, Vietnam, and grew up in a home within the walls of the old imperial capital. After graduating from business college in Da Nang in 1992, she met her future husband in Hue. They relocated to Portland in 1995. Thuy returned to school for a bachelor's degree in accounting at USM. After taking time out to raise 2 children, she returned to work as an interpreter and now works as a Vietnamese parent community specialist at Portland Public Schools. Her work as a bridge builder between educators and students and families has expanded to include work as navigator of legal, medical, and governmental issues. Thuy is also a member of the Unified Asian communities. So with that, these are the panelists, and we are going to start with Rata.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Grace, for going through each of the panelists. Nice to meet everybody. Thank you, Chris, for the history on the war in Southeast Asia. I remember reading or listening to Henry Kissinger saying that Cambodia was a sideshow. But I was only 4 years old, so I don't have quite an elaborate memory as you might have. But I am one of 3 surviving siblings, a family of 10. So that 70% death rate in my family certainly didn't feel like a sideshow to me. If I may also add a little bit further in that history, I think I'm essentially an exhibit A of American foreign policy. And I'm pretty sure some other panelists in a similar way came from different, war-torn countries, and most recently from Iraq and Afghanistan and so forth and so on. So we basically Americans, we went out there and tried to change the world, and we screwed it up badly, and then we took the best and brightest. So we are gift to America, foreign policy failure. I guess I'm a big critic against American foreign policy, as you might realize, Chris. And some may not realize, why would a banker be interested in international relations? Well, the reason why I study international relations, because I want to understand what happened to me, what happened to my family, and what happened to Cambodia. Now, I spent over close to $100,000 just to find that answer. At the end of that, I did not have an answer to that question, why, what would happen. I understood the war, I understand the situation, the political dynamic, but I did not understand the killing fields. I did not understand the devastations. The only thing, after spending $100,000, the only thing that came out with that was that Cambodia was an accident of geography. So that was a very expensive lesson. And then I won a scholarship, just to elaborate a little bit on my bio, I won a scholarship for the Department of Defense. And I was paid to study overseas for as what you call the eyes and ears of the American embassies, basically somebody on the ground as a student I would write reports in exchange for getting free schooling and travel overseas. Doesn't get better than that from a college student perspective. But what I discovered quickly was that it was very dangerous for somebody like me with a liberal education to go back to Cambodia and go back to Thai, because my charge was to be an observer. My charge was to be indifferent. But having survived the killing field, having survived the war, having lived overseas at the receiving end, I cannot be what you call an unbiased observers. So needless to say, I got involved in a lot of troubles, protesting mostly. Then I got threatened a few times to put in jails and so forth and so on. The only reason why they didn't kill me because I carry American passport. And then at the end of that program, I was supposed to be working for the State Department, but I decided that it would not be healthy for me because as the only known surviving male member in my family, I could not, at my own conscience, give me what my mom done to me to bring me to America, only to potentially discover me in a ditch somewhere. So I couldn't bring myself to work for the State Department. So I decided to come back and become a banker. But if I could move back a little bit, before I do that, Grace, how much time do I have? Because I can talk
Each
forever.
panelist has about 5 minutes.
Ooh, okay, but I'll catch you up then. Thank you for that. I wish I had asked a question sooner. But coming to America at 14, it was a very scary time. I spoke no English. I had virtually no schooling. But of course, at 14, you can't put me in kindergarten. I'll beat up everybody there. At 14, spoke no English and had very, very limited education before then. It was a struggle. I failed most of my classes. And it took me years to get some sort of comfort level in the education level. For example, right now, even though I graduated from college, any senior high school student today has more years of schooling than I do. If you recall in Cambodia, and when the Khmer came over, they abolished schooling. And of course, I happened to be 5 years old at the time and no school for me. So by the time I came here, I'm very, very behind academically. So fortunately, through sheer determination, efforts, and just sheer struggles, I started from being a flunky to the number 21 of my class of a class of 248 students. So that was a resiliency on my part, and you know, it's what I credit to a lot of support from teachers. I credit to a lot of friends who helped me along the way. And I just credit to I admire the American educational system to allow people to explore, to go as far as you could. And after that, I joined banking. Well, first I went to college and studied overseas through Department of Defense and State Department, but came back and then became a banker ever since. I think I should cut it short because I think it's definitely more than 5 minutes, Grace. I apologize for that. I should have asked for a time slot first.
No problem. You're a compelling speaker.
Thank you.
So next up is Terry.
I thought I was the third one, but
no, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Grace, for having me tonight, and then thank you for Portland Public School for putting this event together. So since I was born after the war, so I can share with you a little bit the story about what it's like to grow up in a country that was devastated by war. So I was born basically in 1979, and back then, there was no functional schools or medical facilities, and like nothing. And but the most painful is that, no teachers, no doctors, no artists survived, because they all killed, most of them during Khmer Rouge. And also, growing up in a household whom, parents and 3 older siblings were war survivors, and watching them go through all these struggles all years, at the time when I was young, I didn't quite understand how war really affects my family and my country, and I remember that, mom couldn't, every time she could, if she heard any loud noises, she would like run and hide herself in a room somewhere. And then so she would be worried about not having enough food, she just want to stock up food all the time, because again, you're in Khmer Rouge, you don't have food, and my 3 older brothers who were survivors, they were having struggle to learn, and there's a lot of challenges, growing up. And I guess that I was like a golden child, that I was born after the war. I didn't have to go through all the trauma, they have experienced. And so and then I remember also around probably late 80s, where we didn't have clean water, we didn't have electricity. And again, I was born and I was grown up in a city. This is talking about the capital city. And then I think in 1989, we had probably electricity around like 2 hours a day, around like between like 7 to 9 o'clock. And then we had to go and get like some water, and then we had to use some sort of chemical to make the water clean. And being a child, I was like having a good time playing. Didn't know that we were like 20 years. Cambodia was 20 years, 30 years behind everybody else, in the world, even though our neighboring countries like Thailand or Singapore, or, well, I guess Thailand probably a good example to say. And walking to school at first grade, when I first started first grade, hearing these gunshots, and people were just terrified. And then we couldn't take family vacation to the beach, because again, some part of Khmer Rouge soldiers still control certain part of the country. And then I remember also one time when my dad decided to kind of take a big trip to Sihanouk. We were probably about 3.5 hours away from where we lived. And I mean, the actual trip would take about 3 hours, but took us about 6 hours, and the road was so bad. And and so all the men in the car equipped with guns, and I didn't quite understand why you be on a vacation, why do you have gun, and all this and then still don't understand, right? And just but I might go too long, sorry Grace, I was a little bit unprepared for this. But all of that, throughout the hope and resilient, watching growing up, watching my parents raise the 4 of us. And then the biggest hope is like to make sure that we all educated. And yes, me and my 3 older brothers, along with my cousin, who my parents were raised, we all, went to college, for the first time, and I just don't know how my parents or my siblings managed to survive. And and my parents raised wonderful 4 children. And so I'm very new in America, I've been here for 5 years now. And so I'm learning, being an interpreter. It helps me a lot to learn about, all the effects of war, trauma that people have been, carrying with them for years and years. So then I remember one day I went to interpret and I realized I was, and then the patient started to describe all the symptoms and all of a sudden, and then, oh my gosh, all this, it happens to my mom, So I realized that, all the members, everybody in my family, has been living with trauma for years. But again, go back with hope and resilience, they still survive and so yeah, here we are, here I am. So, and yeah, sorry, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And just want to let people know that Terry didn't know that she was doing this until 2 hours ago because she had somebody backed out. So thank you so much. So she really deserves a big applause for doing this. And so she's really not prepared. And she was telling me, I really am not a good public speaker, Grace. I said, no, you're right. So I'm amazed that of what you mean by not a good public speaker, because you touched me deeply.
Thank you, Grace.
So our next presenter is it Twee or Doug? In the who's in the
Twee.
Okay, Twee.
Next, I'm gonna pull it up. Hold on.
Okay, I have to say that I have a fear of public speaking, so you are not alone, Thierry.
Okay, Twee, here we are.
Okay, so this is my great uncle. He went to the same military school as the president of South Vietnam, President Thieu, and when he became an officer, he was granted the sword he ran out from the King of Vietnam, and he was the one who rescued my father from the people who fought for Viet Minh. And these are my siblings, 9 of us. My sister Nga is at the second row from the right, the third person from the right. And back then, my family was living in a house 2 blocks away from this An Hoa Gate. And at midnight, when the fireworks cracked all over the city, my sister Nga saw men with weapons crouching along the ramparts of the citadel walls. And she said that these soldiers were allied with Hanoi. And so she hurried inside to tell my father, who was at home, and he fled the city. He fled at once. And my family had fled ahead of the communists, streaming south on Highway 1, with more than 30 people packed in a single van, a Dodge, my father recalled. In Da Nang, my family heard there were American ships offshore, and so we planned to try for them. But the reports coming back were grim. Smaller boats from the evacuation flotilla sidled up against ships, and children were passed up upward. Children and people were falling to death between them. And when my family heard about the planes were coming into American airfield in Da Nang, my father and my older brother made an attempt to catch the last flight out of Vietnam. This was my father's idea, and if they could get out later, they could retrieve the family from America. Thousands had the same idea, and my father never made it off the tarmac. So he got back on his little scooter and went back to my hometown. This is my father, one of the outings with my husband and I. And my mother from the far right, she was attending our engagement. And I met my husband, James Sullivan, in 1992 in Vietnam. He was bicycling from Saigon to Hanoi. At that time, he was writing a article for Bicycling magazine. And 2 years later, we got married, and I came to America in 1995. And these people are the loves of my life. picture was taken in Colorado. We visited 2 years ago. Cullen is 20 years old and Vivian is 18 years old. Both of them are attending college, Kobe College right now. Thank you so much for listening. That's the end of my stories.
Thank you so much, Twee. Those are beautiful pictures.
Mhm.
Thank you.
So we are going to have Dog is the next one.
Mhm.
Thanks. I am both humbled and honored to be here this evening. Hearing the stories of resilience is just amazing. I was a college kid, drafted 18 weeks after I was in college. I was walking down this path. This is the path to the village of Bongsan in the Central Highlands. I was in a little fire base attached to the 173rd Airborne, and I was there for 411 days and nights. This is me. This picture was taken after my first mortar attack. Sort of the idea, somebody had the idea of trying to get pictures of all of us after we had our first experience of war. There were many mortar attacks to follow. We were very concerned about being overrun. This is how we would rumble through the small little villages of the Central Highlands. Terrifying people, no doubt, nonstop. I drove a 2.5 truck and was told never to stop, no matter what. And I witnessed a couple of accidents that we just kept on going. This is how we lived for 13.5 months. I spent many an hour at night on those guard bunkers. As I said, the nights got very, very dark, and we were very scared most of the time. Even though we wouldn't admit it, we had a certain sense of bravado. There's the enemy. Little kids would come up from the village of Bongsan and look through the concertina wire at us like we were some kind of strange animals at a zoo, which in a sense we were, I believe. But we were told not to go into the village. In fact, it was off limits, although we snuck into it. Whenever we left the village, or left the fire base rather, I was driving a 2.5, and we would be accompanied by a Jeep in front of us and a Jeep behind us, bristling with weapons, constantly bristling with weapons, flak jackets, helmets, M60s, M16s. And I entered this world of Vietnam as a spoiled kid. I like to say that I was the most privileged subspecies ever to exist on this planet, a white male raised in suburbia of the United States. And I encountered this amazing lifestyle there. I was totally struck by the Vietnamese people and how they lived and survived. This is a still life from the village of Bongsan. This is the way folks lived. And as we slipped into their village and tried to befriend Vietnamese people, they obviously were terrified of us and not trusting us too much. This is a main drag, if you will, in Bongsan, little shops and stuff. Again, we were not allowed to get out of our vehicles at any time. So all I could do is drive by and take a look at this stuff. Although we did obviously break the law and break the rules all the time. So last picture, this young girl, we called her Little Butterfly. And I guess, I don't know, she's 12 years old or something like that. She was our main source of drugs and prostitutes. And that's how I end this thing with as a father and a grandfather, the tremendous remorse I feel for what we did, the damage we did to the children of Vietnam.
Thank you, Doug. So next up is Caitlyn.
Hi, my name is Caitlyn, and this is like my family's story, kind of. It kind of goes into how their journey plays in my leadership. So my dad's family is a family of 8, and their immigration story started in 1988, and they left Hulku, Vietnam, and they headed to the Philippines, where they spent 6 months there. And their trip was funded by the Maine Catholic charities. And the family shared one suitcase, and each person had like an individual bag. When they like left Piluku, they just brought whatever they could grab because they couldn't really bring much, and they left their entire family behind. In the Philippines, they like worked for money, and when they got to the US, they got jobs until they were financially stable. They were able to visit Vietnam, and that's when my dad met my mom, and they got married, and it allowed us to immigrate. And through my family's immigration story, it allowed me to step up and become a leader. In my volleyball team, it lacks a lot of teamwork and guidance, so I really want to step up and help others become better and really work together. And my hockey team has amazing leadership, and I really want to help others because my teammates help everyone off and on the ice, and they inspire me to do the same, especially people who are like starting out and dealing with problems on their own. And in my lacrosse team, my teammates really helped me understand the game, because when I joined, I was really like confused, and it was just like a lot to take in, and they were really stepping up and trying to like get me to keep going. And I feel like that's really important. And in my Key Club, which is a volunteering club, I help people outside of my community, and it just like allows us to give back, especially since my family immigrated from people who helped them. And so I was able to like make origami for elders. And so for this is like my like motivation to going into Medfield, because my cousin who passed away a couple years ago because he died of a terminal illness, and the doctors helped him fight every day, and that's really a big impact. And I personally want to go in anesthesia, which is amazing because they help people through surgeries, and they are really helpful, and they never get the credit because it's always the surgeons. Like, they do a lot of the work too, and it's hands-on. So since I was given the opportunity for a scholarship money to enter a summer program, I chose the Harvard one because it allows me to challenge myself and work with others, and it really allows me to like understand the med field more before I enter it. And I think that with all my leadership throughout my years, it really reflects back on my family, because without their story, I wouldn't be stepping up as less or as more as I would want. Wait, that didn't sound right, but they just inspire me to step up more and give back, because they were helped by the Maine Catholic charities, and they went out of their way just to help my family, just to get to where they are now, and that's really important to me. And I just want to give back to others. Thank you.
Thank you so much, panelists. Thank you, Caitlyn. That was wonderful and inspiring story to end. It doesn't seem like there's a sport that you don't play. So that's really amazing, athlete. This is a section of the presentation when audience can ask their questions. Is there a question in the Q&A or in the chat?
There's a question asking Twee if she can explain more how her family survived.
Yes. So actually that when the war was ending in 1975, my family decided to leave Hue. The communists have broke Quảng Trị city, and we were afraid because my father had fought for the South Army. So we got into a van with 3 other families, and there was 30 of us in this little van, and we fled south. The road was very crowded, and thousands and thousands of people were heading south in Highway 1, trying to get to Da Nang. And I was 4.5 years old at that time. And in Da Nang, we stayed in a little school. And I remember helicopters flying overhead. My father tried to get out of the airport, and we all tried to get out of the seaport, but actually there was no luck. So we have to go back to Hue. And when we got back, our house was broke. We had nothing. And during the war, I remember my mother was saying that our houses were burned down 3 times. But at that time we had nothing. So my father and my mother started to rebuild. Thank you.
There's a question for Chris. Chris, were you drafted or did you volunteer?
Okay. I was not able, I submitted an answer, but let me do it verbally. I did volunteer. I volunteered. I signed up in January of 1967 in Boston, actually, and then I reported for active duty in September of 1967. So I was a volunteer. I was not a conscript.
I'm just curious for those of the panelists who are parents, you know, how how does the impact of the war influence the way you raise your children?
I can take a crack at it. I have a 15-year-old and I have a 9-year-old boys. I guess my wife and I have been married for a number of years. We waited for a long time to have children, and part of it because we both were very fearful of bringing, children to this world, given what we had gone through, and particularly me. And I was born in 1972, and you know what happened there, Chris and Doug. It's the whole world got turned upside down in that part of the world, and I never known peace. And after the war, there was killing fields, 4-year genocides, and after that, about 10 years of civil war. So I had never known peace. The first time I ever known peace when I came to the U.S. I didn't know what peace was like. I didn't know what normalcy was like. So I have always been fearful of raising a family. I guess, but as I was growing up, I observed different family setting, different environments, going from, failing for most of my class, initially in my early years, and taking on classes that most of the kids struggle. So I befriended with a lot of kids who were struggling. And I discovered that much of the challenges that people had, it's not intellectual capacity, it's not intellectual ability, it's not even IQ, it's upbringing. Because I remember playing with kids who could barely, make it through school, and they were beating me at games, Dungeon and Dragon. Back then, that's what we play. We don't have the fancy machine like now and then. But then as I move up the rank and move up the classes, I go to honor classes and CPA classes that prep you for college. And I discovered that those kids were not any smarter than the kid who was struggling. The difference was that parenting. The difference was that an open dialogue between parents and students. And I learned the difference between a middle-class way of raising children and a family who struggle. All parents care deeply for their children, regardless of the economic background or their circumstances. What I learned the difference was that people who struggle, parents who struggle, they dictate to their children. They tell them what to do. They don't lead by example. be a parent in the middle class who I befriended doctors and lawyers, business owners. There's a different conversation they had with the children. So I guess what I'm trying to get here, what it teach me is resiliency, that because of my struggle early on, going through different economic stratas, befriended people of different walk of life in America, see the differences. I learned that it's not who you are you start out with, it's what you do with yourself. And so I try to do emulate the same thing with my children, is to have more like an engaging, open exploration, as opposed to this is what you do, this is how life is. I don't dictate to my kids what life should be. I encourage them to explore. I mean, I want them to follow where their heart is. If they can be a street sweeper, I want them to sweep the best street ever there is out there. But if they want to be a doctor, I want to be the best doctor there is out there. I want them to follow the dream. So in a way, I try to emulate, try to impart my struggles, my resiliency to my children by basing on not dictation, not telling them what to do, but it's invite them to explore. And I'm been very fortunate. I'm not saying that I earn all the credit, I take all the credits, but I think I've played a small part in how to raise my children, because I'm very proud that my boys are all A students, and they excel academically in sports, and they are a good person in general, and they're very empathetic to other people, and I try to teach them the differences out there in the world, especially in light of the recent last few years, to teach them to be a better human being, not teaching them to succeed, but to be a better person. That's my message to my children. That's how I raise them.
Anyone else who care to answer the question? Oh, there's another question in there. There are other questions. So the next question is from Teresa. Hi, Teresa. The war created a lot of animosity between countries, especially between Cambodia and Vietnam. How do you feel about this now?
Okay, I can answer. I have some little, I have a little answer for this question. So Vietnam and Cambodia had problems because they were right next to each other, and Cambodia got pulled into the war, and Vietnamese ran the Ho Chi Minh Trail through Cambodia, and pretty soon there was bombing in Cambodia. So I think that because of that, it was terrible for everyone. Yeah, that's my idea.
If I may add to that, I guess I'm a little bit of history buff, Chris, although I do not have a major in history. The struggle between Cambodia went back way before the Vietnam War. Half of Vietnam was given, it belonged to Cambodia, was given to Vietnam by the French. If you notice, most the name of the village and towns in South Vietnam is Cambodian names. So as a way to appease the Emperor of Vietnam back then, the French gave essentially half of Cambodia to Vietnam. So there's tremendous animosity between Cambodia and Vietnam. And also, the other dynamic is, Chris sort of mentioned that a little bit earlier, is that the Khmer rule, even though initially they were comrade in arms when they were fighting the American, but when the war was over, they turned against each other. The Khmer rule on day one, when they came to power, invaded Vietnam. They want to take back South Vietnamese. So there's a lot of animosity between Vietnamese and Cambodia. But I just want to give you my little background. There's a little bit of Vietnamese in me. I think I'm a 20% Vietnamese. One of my great grandparents from Vietnam. So I can hear, my mom can speak a little bit Vietnamese. I do not speak Vietnamese. I can hear the dynamic among the family discussion because the families have foot on either side of the Vietnamese and the Cambodian border. So I got exposed to both sides.
Anyone else? There's another question here, and your greatest hope and your greatest fear today. So maybe let's have this answered by every one of the panel, including Chris and Doug.
Who do you want to go first?
Doesn't matter, whoever has the answer now.
I have the answer. Silence. Earlier you asked about Veterans for Peace. Four other veterans formed a group called Veterans for Peace in 1985, and our goal is to abolish war and to do it non-violently. So that's been my guiding principle for the last X number of years. And my hope is that my grandchildren will live in a world without war, my granddaughters. So those are my hopes.
Hi, I can go next, sorry. So my greatest hope is that people learn from, past mistakes, and, hopefully that history won't repeat. And then again, and also, but there's also the hope that, like Douglas, that, my future generation don't have to go through the war or pain, like, my parents' generation or my generation had to go through. And then the greatest fear, like people sometimes feeling comfy and then they forget, and then history will repeat itself again. So we have to, make sure that, bring awareness, and then all people would remember, and then, thank you.
I can go next. Growing up in my family, I've heard a lot of stories about the wars. My parents' neighbors, the father took the daughter to go to the relative's house for a ceremony. And the next day they went back home because the bomb had landed on their house. It was next to my mother's house. The entire family was dead except for the father and the daughter. And in my family, part of us were on the South Army and part of us were on the North Army. So in the same family, we were fighting each other. I ever heard horrible stories, and I never want war to ever happen again. I always wish that the leaders of the country could talk. We don't have to fight. And so that is my hope, and that's also the fear. I don't want the war to ever happen again. And I hope everyone on this panel can visit Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. There are great beaches, beautiful countries, rivers, and mountains. So please visit after the COVID is over. Thank you.
By the way, I also posted a question. It was for you, Thuy, but probably Rhoda and Thierry too. Have you, well, let me preface this by saying when I did my courses on Vietnam, I had signed a book called When Heaven and Earth Change Places. I don't know if you've heard of it, by a Vietnamese woman. She grew up in a peasant family, went through some pretty horrible experiences, and then came to the United States in 1970. In the mid-1980s, she returned to Vietnam and talked about the kind of reception she had. And at that time, relations between Vietnam and the United States were still pretty antagonistic. And And so she was looked upon with suspicion. I was wondering, for you folks, you three, have you gone back and what was the reception you got? I mean, when did you go back and what was the reception you got from friends, former associates, people who stayed in country, government officials and so forth? It's kind of a broad question, but I'm curious as, you know, I've heard mixed reports, you know, about that. And also there's been an extraordinary number of American Vietnam veterans who've gone to Vietnam. And, you know, it's obviously a changed place, very impressed with it in many respects. I wish I could go back if somebody would pay my way. So that's the big question I have for you folks. Anybody want to comment?
I guess I can give a crack at it. I got back, the first time was part of schooling where I went there as part of Department of Defense and State Department. So my nose was on the ground. In fact, I was recruited by the then government to be part of in other words, come back and work for us. As you recall, the majority or 90% of educated Cambodian were killed, were slaughtered during the killing fields.
Yeah.
Including my uncles and father, who was a school principal, and then when the war started, joined the army, were drafted, and then became a captain. And my brother was a pilot, and a few other were business owners. So my family was devastated. I'm the only known surviving male member in my family. And then my family mostly boys, and I have two sisters. My hat out to the ladies, you are way stronger than boys. So a family of 10 with 8 boys, only one made it and 2 girls made it. So it goes to show the female species are way stronger than the men. The reason why I want to bring this up is that you never once you stay in the country and you come back, you're never going to be the same. You would never be fully accepted. So I developed friendships. I was recruited back into the country, but there's always this sense that you don't quite understand it. So and it's one of those feelings that I can also, even though I've been in America for 30 years, I never quite feel like I'm 100% belong. And I went back to Cambodia the first time to work and study, and the second time just simply for vacations. I never quite feel like I belong there. So I guess I'm a nomad, do not quite belong in any environment. I'm not saying that people were critical. I'm not saying people were harsh, but it's that feeling that once you're removed, once you're pulled away, you never quite feel 100% belonging. Although I have a yearning to go back to Cambodia every 5-10 years or so. And another thing,
Did we lose Rata? We may have to, you want to answer that, Twee, or Caitlyn, or Terry? He's got frozen.
I know I'm not from Vietnam, but like my parents are, and I've gone back with them, and they've always said how it's like different, especially with like now there's like building big businesses, and they've seen how like big it's changed and how everything is so different, and how they hope that it stays like peaceful and just like a happy place. And it's really like sad to know that there was like a time where everything was like really troubling and there was a lot of hatred towards one another. And I think that it's like important for like people to like really understand their origins and never lose that. And I think that's like why my parents like go back to Vietnam a lot, just like to see what their life like could be if they had stayed.
I think that back then in mid 1990s, people were afraid back then, but I think that now it is so much better. People are not afraid anymore. And I went back to Vietnam in 2005 when my kids were little. And I remember in 1995 when I left Vietnam, just seemed so poor. But in 2005, it was so much appealing. It seems like it is a welcoming country. A lot of people just love my children. Like they didn't have it, they couldn't have enough of them. So we rented a nhà rường, the house of columns. So we stay in that house, and every day my kids would go to a school run by Catholic nuns, and it was wonderful. The life over there is very easy. Everybody is always there. Even though if you are in the house alone, you are not alone, because if you just step out of your door, then people are everywhere. And I have a very fond memory. It is one of the dearest places in my memory, in my mind. So yeah, please visit Vietnam someday. You will love it.
Terry?
Well, I've been back to Cambodia once in 2017 because been in the US not long ago. But before I moved to the US, I traveled a lot and spent 7 years in Singapore. And I was so happy that when I went back in 2017, that Cambodia started catching up with the rest of the world. we they had like McDonald's there, and Starbucks was just there a couple of years ago, and because I grew up in Cambodia, I'm very embedded in with my culture and all that, and always love to. Well, sometimes once in a while I feel like, well, because in fact I've been in America, they call me American. I don't really like that because again, I'm still my heart and my soul is still Cambodian, and oftentimes I just remind people around me, don't tease me that way. And then yeah, otherwise, I just love it. I love going back and see my family, see my friends, and I love it here. Maine is the first state that I ever moved to the US, and I feel like home, and people complain about, we don't have a lot of diversity here in Maine, but I think it's to me, I mean, compared to New York, of course, but at the same time, I feel like home, and we have a lot of work to do, but I think just, work in progress. So, I know I love it here. So